Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to an RPG Storytime, where I go ahead and talk about, things that I've either done as a player or as a DM. Mostly as a DM, because I find myself DMing a lot more often than I actually end up playing. This one, I'm not sure how well it's going to go, because it's actually, I could sum the story up in basically one sentence, but that wouldn't be amusing. So, we'll go ahead and give you a little bit of a background. Now, I play most of my games nowadays online. I do not have a lot of time to go ahead and sit down face-to-face with people anymore, just because of the overhead and time that takes. So I run a lot of my stuff through Roll20, and this was actually the remnants of a campaign that I had actually intended to put up on the channel. And it was a Curse of Strahd campaign, and they got about 3 sessions into the Curse of Strahd campaign and wiped. Yeah, real early. It might not have even been 3 sessions. It may have been 2 and then some change. Yeah, it was 3 sessions, but it was real early on the 3rd session. Anyway, that's besides the point. That is why I record now when I'm going to put something on the YouTube channel or whatever. That's why I record several sessions in, just to make sure they're not going to completely botch it right out of the gate nowadays. Anyway, that particular party wanted to go ahead and play the same characters, but they did not want to run Curse of Strahd again. And I can't blame them. They got beat pretty bad on that one. And it was really, really quick right off the bat. So what they wanted to do was just to simply take the characters, pretend like they never wiped, and move them to run other dungeons. And for a while, not a long time, but I had, at that time, I was still waiting for Tomb of Annihilation to set that up. That's the one I'm currently, as of this recording, putting up on my channel. But before that got started, we had a little bit of downtime, a little bit of lag time while I got that settled. So I ran them through a couple dungeons. And these weren't dungeons that I made, but rather they were dungeons that I pulled out of existing books. At that point, Tales from the Yawning Portal had just come out, so I ran them through White Plume Mountain. And I believe I put some of that up on the channel, although my audio was really screwy through that one. After White Plume Mountain, they wanted to continue running the characters through a couple of dungeons here and there, so I was like, sure, we'll just go ahead and level them up, and I can run them through a dungeon here and a dungeon there. I did a few out of Kobold Press's Book of Lairs, which is associated with their Tome of Beasts. Actually, it may not. Is it called Book of Lairs? I forget. I may have to look that up. I've got the PDF for that. I've got the actual hard copy of the Tome of Beasts, which I admit is actually a pretty solid offering. I do have a review of it up on my channel, but that's besides the point. I was running them through basically these mini dungeons, standalone dungeons. You go into a dungeon, see how it works, and then you get out. Not a lot of actual person-to-person role-playing, but they got to play their characters in a variety of situations. And after they went through the White Plume Mountain, they said that was too easy. And then when they went through the Kobold Press stuff, the complaint on those was that the dungeons themselves were difficult, not because the dungeons were difficult, but because the monsters were arbitrarily difficult. And I have to admit, as much as I do love the Kobold Press stuff, they do have a sort of almost 4th edition kind of idea on a lot of their dungeon designs, where the dungeons are basically rooms interconnected with increasingly difficult combat encounters. There are traps. That's not to say there's not traps. There are traps. There are unusual things, but generally speaking, the traps are very easily avoidable. And there was this sense that the players, they admitted that they wanted a challenge, but they wanted a challenge that was more than just harder hitting monsters. So, in essence, an old school type challenge. Old school games did tend to have hard hitting monsters, but they did tend to have a wider variety of more interesting things other than just, oh look, another combat encounter. A lot of old school dungeons did have that sort of another combat encounter kind of mentality where you kick in the door and oh, look, more orcs. But they also tended to have kind of a good mix of stuff, and or at least the good ones. And so I was looking through my collection, because I do have a number of PDFs that I've purchased over the years that are just nothing but dungeon collections. Now, I rarely use them, but a lot of times I'll look through them and say, oh, that's an interesting trap, that's an interesting room, that's an interesting encounter, and it provides me with some sort of inspiration for some things that I do. I admit I tend to do a lot of just combat counter after combat counter when I'm putting stuff together, but that's mostly in my casual type things. But anyway, they wanted to run some older school stuff, so I went through and I was thinking, well, how do I challenge this group? Because at this point, they'd been through a few dungeons pretty easily. So how do I challenge this group without just resorting to, difficult monsters after difficult monster? And I didn't have at that point enough time to come up with something myself, because I was up to my eyeballs in work, which I still am, of course, but at that time I was just looking for something off the shelf. I could grab, be an old school solution. And where else do you go for that kind of thing than Frog God Games? I love their Quest of Doom series. I have not got any of their most recent offerings because they switched formats. The first couple books of the Quest of Doom series were books that were collections of adventures. And these adventures could be very short or moderately short to moderately long. And they were basically collections of different adventures for different sorts of arrangements of monsters and levels. And they've switched since then to a more easily accessible format. So instead of a big book of that's a collection of adventures, instead you've got individual adventures that all go into a series, and you can buy them individually. So I'm not sure that I like that change, simply because I have not actually bought any of their adventures since. But then again, I've had other things to spend my money on. I might have to take a look at the individual adventure layout. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So I looked through my Frog God Games Quest of Doom series, and I'm looking for one of their approximate level. And at this point, it's not necessarily a campaign per se, rather they're just going from dungeon to dungeon, just having fun while in the background. I think this was actually right before Tomb of Annihilation came out, so I was actually waiting for Tomb of Annihilation to hit, and I said, and then you'll have to give me a couple weeks to get used to it before we begin actually running it. Anyway, so I pulled out the Quest of Doom stuff, and I see this interesting one. Well, he's interesting to me. It was called Citadel of the Sorcerer. And really, it's less of a citadel and more like just a tower with a dungeon under it. That's not exactly how you define citadel. A citadel would be attached to a city. This wasn't. But it was basically the whole premise is that you hear about this tower that was run by an evil sorcerer out in the wilderness that nobody's come back from, and then you go to it. And there's more to it than that. I encourage you to check out, the Frog God Games Quest of Doom series if you want to find out more. But there's not a lot of background to it. Just like evil wizard, not been seen for a while, supposedly has a bunch of treasure. Not necessarily even evil wizard, just a recluse wizard. Supposedly has a bunch of treasure, has a bunch of other stuff. Locked away in this tower, nobody's come back from yet. And so they say, okay, well, we'll take that, because if we don't have an adventure. Because that's basically how it goes. If you've got something that simple, the DM's throwing it out there to you, you can either go for it or just go home. So they decided to go for it. And the group consisted of a conversion, and some of you who have been watching my stuff may recognize these characters. They had a Rennie Relias Jr., who was a half-elven bard. They had a Dane Glanrel, and I've still got their character sheets over on Roll20. They had a Dane Glanrel, who was a cleric. A dwarven cleric. They had Nestario Lenbrook, who was a half-elven sorcerer. And finally, they had Tyrdra Blaze, who was a human fighter. And so they go in there. It's your basic four-person party. And they head on in there. And this place is just full of traps. In fact, in terms of monsters, I think you can get most of the way through the place without encountering a single combat encounter. I mean, they're in there, but a lot of them are like triggered or optional encounters. And so the premise is that you go ahead and you go into this tunnel, and there's spoilers for the adventure, so if you're playing the adventure, you might want to tune into another RPG story time. But basically, you go into this tunnel, up this tower, to the top of the tower, and then you find a teleporter that basically brings you down into the dungeon below the tower. And the tower itself you can't get into. Not from the outside. You have to follow the way, because it's otherwise pretty much completely invulnerable. So, it's one of those old school wherein, well, why can't we just bust through the walls? Because this party had actually spent a fairly large amount of time just busting through walls. And in fact, if you watch the White Plume Mountain write-up I had, they took to actually just punching and hacking through stone walls, like about halfway through. So, you do what you can. Anyway, so they go ahead and go through, and the first passage is basically just like this poisoned corridor. And the funny part about that was the person that was leading it is a dwarf, and dwarves have a pretty strong resistance to poison. And so immediately, the issue is that poison is not. In fact, I'm looking at the notes right now because I remember it was an interesting sort of thing because you've got this corridor that just leads down at an angle, and you've got like skeletons laid out in the corridor. And what it turns out is that once you get to a certain point in the corridor, you've got like this contact poison that works even through boots and such. And so they've got this dwarf, and they're gonna, send him out. But the funny part is that dwarf, they're sending their they don't, trust me on this, they do not send their cleric out on point, as much as the cleric wanted to go out on point. They had no idea this corridor was poisoned. All they saw was this long, dark corridor with skeletons scattered across. So the first guy that goes in is actually, I believe, Rennie. I think that's the first one that goes in. And the thing about this group is that through some fluke of loot and the ability to purchase a few things, they ended up with most of the group having the ability to fly. Due to, I believe, winged boots. Yeah, winged boots. I'm looking at the character sheet right now. Winged boots. Yeah, so not everybody had winged boots, but almost everybody had winged boots. And the issue is that most of them, like I think two of them had winged boots, and one of them had like almost not a permanent fly, but a relatively permanent fly. Oh, he had a broom of flying. That's what he did. That's what he had. So the first guy goes in on point, and he's flying. And as he's flying, he's not touching anything, and therefore he didn't actually set the poison off. And so then the next person down the line was the cleric. And so the cleric does end up getting touching the poison, but because they're a dwarf, they manage to get out of it without dying. And so Q, the party's spending about close to 40 minutes trying to figure out how to get down this corridor. And the funny part was that only the dwarf could not fly. So they could have literally, any one of them, just tried to either carry the dwarf or grant him flying through a spell or a potion or something. But no, instead they insisted that they have to walk down this corridor. So they spent like 40 minutes on this thing. And eventually they did get down the corridor. But I think eventually they ended up basically flying down one by one. And that cued the start of a game wherein they knew that they had entered basically a different kind of dungeon. This was a kind of dungeon that was old school, that had sometimes arbitrary traps, that had its challenge not through monsters that just pop up and one-shot you, but through actual puzzle solving and thinking. So after this point, they do relatively well. They blew through most of the tower without issue. And the tower actually has got like 4 levels now. I'm looking at it. It's like you go down this corridor into one level, and then they just went up level by level. But the interesting part, I don't know if it's interesting or not, or rather just a symptom of the kind of players that I have, but they managed to, through completely different means, they managed to set fire to the interior of every single room as they went up the tower. Not intentionally. I'm assuming it wasn't intentional. But they would try certain things, and they would, like the first room that they open up in, is that they're not sure what's in it, so what do? They open up the door and then immediately cast Fireball into the room. They don't know what's in there. They don't know if anything's violent. They just like, breach it and clear it with a Fireball. Boom! I don't know what they were expecting, but they go level by level up this tower. And near the top, they're complaining that all they're finding is cinders. And I'm like, yeah, well, stop setting things on fire. And they're like, well, maybe we'll consider that. But anyway, they get up there, and then the top has a teleporter that leads down into a dungeon area. Now, the dungeon area goes pretty easily. There are maybe just under a dozen rooms in this dungeon. And the premise of the dungeon is that there's this large central chamber with what is known as the sorcerer's treasure, and nobody really knows what the treasure is. And then you've got all these side rooms, and some of them have different sorts of traps, and some of them have creatures in them. One of them, interestingly enough, has a creature that is an enemy, but it pretends not to be an enemy. And this is another case where the creature basically greeted the party and tried to befriend them, and they fireballed him anyway. And it was like, okay, well, I guess if you're going to be combating them, roll initiative. And they went pretty far in this dungeon. The most trouble that they had, aside from what I will terminate the story on, the most trouble they had were that there are these keys. There's these keys, and I don't want to get into too many spoilers, but in case one of my viewers may want to run through it sometime. But there's basically these keys, and you collect them and you fit them together. And they're not actual keys. They're keys, and that they're parts of some sort of medallion or whatever. And then there's some doors, and all of the doors look like the correct one, except that if you try the amulet in one of the false doors, or you try to open one of the false doors in a manner that is not involving the amulet, it basically shoots a lightning bolt at you. I think it's actually a force bolt. So you actually get blasted back, take some damage from the bolt, plus whatever damage it is when you hit the wall. And they're organized in these really weird like niches, so they almost all have like a short corridor, and then there's the door, so you get blasted back into a wall, so you take effectively falling damage from getting blasted back. And one of them has the tunnel wall, the end of it, over a pit. So you take damage from the door, and then from the impact to the back wall, and then if you're not flying, by falling down the pit. And that's a funny trap. That's a really funny trap, actually. I need to use something like that. But they're like I can already see it. Like I could put a dungeon in where you go to a T-junction, and to your left you see a door, and to your right you see like an open pit. There's a visible open pit, and you walk over there, and the DM's like, well, at this dead end you see a 30 to 40 foot deep pit, and they spend some time searching it, and there's nothing but a pit. And then they go back to the door, trigger the trap there, get blasted down the corridor, take damage from impact on the wall, and then fall down the pit too. So I might need to. That's not how it is in this, but that's something I need to remember. Okay. Trap ideas aside. Yeah, that one door, not the one door with the pit, but that trap is similar on every door except for the actual door that enters this chamber. And I swear they played this particular dungeon for 4 sessions. And on the 3rd session, they spent an hour just repeatedly triggering the trap on this one door. Just over and over again. Just like zap, boom, zap, boom. And I was like, am I being unclear as to what happens? Or are they just not getting it? So they spent just when one guy was getting low on hit points, he'd move out and they'd bring, a second guy in. I don't think that they actually triggered it all that. They triggered it like 5 times, I think. 5 times. But that was 5 times. That was 4 times too many, I think. But they had some ideas and they just weren't getting that this was like a false door. I guess because it was kind of after a scattered sort of session, but I may have been unclear in describing the door, but they spent a considerable amount of time. It wasn't just one zap right after the other. There was some space between it. Like they would trigger the trap, and then they'd think about it for a while, and then they'd go about setting up something else, and then they'd trigger the trap again. So, but that is not the highlight of the story, because this story actually ends with a relatively simple trap that was just shockingly amazing and yet also arbitrary. And it's pretty much the premier trap of the dungeon. So when you finally do get towards the correct door, it is... You don't know it because you don't see it yet. The corridor comes across to the west and then turns south. And it's, I'm looking at the map right now, it's like about 60 to 70 feet. And then there's the door at the end that actually leads into the main chamber, but it actually looks like every other door that you've just set the traps off of, if you're this party, which you might be, because some of them do watch my channel. So they turn the corner. But the real trap of this, the real trap of this corridor, is that in the ceiling, there is hung, almost like you used to see in convenience stores. You used to see like mirrors, so you could see things around corners and such. But this one it was like you turn the corridor, and the corridor continues on the way, but there's like a mirror, and it's hung high up, but not so high up that you can't just see it automatically by staring down the corridor. So if you look around the corner, you're going to see this mirror. And this mirror is a mirror of life trapping. I wish I had thought about this one. Because it is so elegantly simple, and in fact that's what mirror of life trappings used to be used for, was exactly this sort of situation. Now in the write-up in the module, it says that it requires a Constitution save. Now, if you recall, I've read out exactly what everybody is. You had a bard, you had a sorcerer, you had a cleric, and you had a fighter. Now, the thing about that is that the clerics got proficiency in charisma saves. But this particular dwarf, I'm looking at it, half of the group had really nice Constitution saves, and half of them really didn't. I mean, I'm looking at it now. Yeah, they're not great Constitution saves. I guess they're not terrible. But the thing about it is that in the module it says Constitution save. But in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition, it says Charisma saves. And aside from that difference, Charisma versus Constitution, there are no differences between this trap and the item in the DMG. So I was struck with a bit of a conundrum. Which one do I use? I've got a group wherein their average Charisma save is better than their average Constitution save. Now that I'm actually looking at their sheet, they don't have that bad Constitution saves, but they still have better Charisma saves, just across the board. Their Charisma saves are just better than their Constitution saves. With one exception. Teardra Blaze, the fighter, does not have either proficiency or a really high charisma. So her charisma save was just 1. But she wasn't the one that looked around the corner first. So this is a DC 15 charisma save. I decided to go with the Dungeon Master's Guide interpretation of the trap. DC 15 charisma save. So the first one to look around the corner is their point man. And their point man is Areni Relias Jr., a half-elven bard with a 20 charisma. His charisma save modifier is +9. That means he has to roll a 6 or higher on a d20 to succeed. Not exactly a, automatic, but if you roll even reasonably, he's going to succeed. So he turns the corner, and he immediately rolls a 1. Now, the effects of a Mirror of Life Trapping are that you get sucked into the Mirror of Life Trapping. You do not pass go. You do not collect $200. So the rest of the group, and I'm looking at the shape of the corridor, and the shape of the corridor is not a right angle, but rather it's like you've got a door, and then you've got like a 45-degree angle into this southern corridor. So the rest of the party sees Rennie open the door, turn the corner, and then nothing else. Because now I'm looking at it, the mirror is positioned just far enough around the corridor that if you've got a torch, you can't see it from the door, you have to go around the corner. Or a lantern, to see it clearly, you have to go around the corner, and you can't see the end of the corridor from the doorway, so you do have to go around the corner to see the end of the corridor. And if you go around the corner, nobody can... If you're around the corner, the rest of the group can't see you unless they've advanced into the corridor themselves, and they didn't. So all they know is that Rennie opened this door and turned a corner, and nothing. They haven't heard from him. So I'm like, okay, well, how long do you wait? And they're like, I don't know, we wait 5-10 minutes. Okay, you wait 5-10 minutes, he doesn't come back. So we're like, well, man, what happened to him? Did we hear him scream? I was like, no, you didn't hear him scream, because all he just like, zoop, he's gone. So, they have a issue there. You've got Estario, Dane, and Teardra. And Dane is the cleric, and he does not want to go around this corner. Because he was metagaming a little bit, I think, because this is a guy that does metagame a little bit. So he's like, "Oh, I don't want to go around the corner. I'm the cleric. You guys need me if you want to get rezzed." And they're like, "Okay, fair enough." So he looked to the sorcerer, and the sorcerer's like, "No, I ain't going around the corner. I'm a sorcerer. I ain't got hit points." So they all look to Teardra, the fighter. So you're strong and tough. You take point. And she's like, "I've only got a +1 charisma save." And they're like, "Well, you can't assume there's a charisma save because that would be metagaming." And so she's like, "Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. We've already encountered like 3 traps that were either based on gazes. I don't think they were actually based on gazes, but they were based on things that were like bright and shiny. In fact, Teardra, there is a room prior that has like glinting pieces of glass, and they can get caught in your eyes. And Teardra had actually been blinded by that trap and needed healing and needed to get her eyes restored. So technically it was metagaming, but she goes, "Well, what I'm going to do is, because I don't want to get blinded again." And they're like, "Oh, okay. Because I don't want to get blinded again, I'm going to take my helmet and turn it around and put it right on my head." So everybody was like, "Okay, well, you look goofy." She's like, "Okay." So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go looking for him. I'm like, "Well, you can't see where you're going because you're blinded, basically." And so she's like, "Oh, well, I'm going to put my hand on the wall and just go down and come back and try and find where Rennie went. And so we're like, okay. All right. So she wanders down the hall. She's got the helm on. She can't see the mirror of the life trapping, so it doesn't go off. She goes down to the hall. She finds the door. Still hasn't found Rennie. Continues on, one hand against the wall, comes back up the corridor, and they see her come back. Nothing's happened to her. And they were like, did you find any traps? And she was like, no. Did you find Rennie? No, but I found a door. And at this point, the party knew that somebody was going to have to go around that corner. And because Teardra did not encounter a trap, they knew that she reported there was no traps. They knew that she came back. They knew that there was a door they needed to check out. And they knew that they did not have their party member back. So in character, you know, they do a pretty good job. They're like, hey, maybe he went through the door. And there was some chatter back and forth. And finally it came down to, well, it's either Dane or Astario. So we're going to send Astario around the corner to look for Rennie. That way Dane can raise him if he triggers a trap. So Astario turns, goes around the corner, turns the corner. Astario is a sorcerer who has proficiency in charisma saves and a 20 charisma. He has a +9 to charisma saves. He has to roll a 6 or above not to get caught in the mirror. He rolls a 2. Zip! Astario disappears. He's in the mirror. He can't scream out. Nothing happens. He's just gone. So Dane and Teardra sit there waiting. He doesn't come back. So finally Dane is like, well, somebody's got to go get him. So Dane turns around, looks in the corner. Dane has proficiency in charisma saves, but he only has a 10 charisma. He gets a +4 to charisma saves because of his basic proficiency bonus at his level. He turns the corner and he rolls a 3. Zip! Into the mirror. And so we got almost the entire party in the mirror. And Teardra is sitting there going, I just want to go home. But I can't go home because I can't get out of this place without my companions. I literally can't because I'm a fighter and I don't have a way out without my companions. So I'm like, okay, well, what do you do? And she's like, well, I go down the hall with my helmet on backwards again. And she goes down the hall. Doesn't find anybody. Does find the door. She can't even open the door at this point because the keys were on the other people. So she comes back. She's like, oh man, I'm going to have to look, aren't I? I'm like, well, you don't have to look, but what are you going to do? You've got the world at your disposal. But due to the fact you're a fighter with very few options, your world consists of basically like 5 corridors. She's like, oh, I know. So she turns and she goes, okay, well, maybe I'll get it because I've got a +1 to save. Maybe I'll roll high. So she turns the corner. She rolls like a 5. She needed like a 14 or above. She rolls like a 5. Zip! In the mirror. Total party wipe. Except they're still alive. Because you don't die when you get into a mirror of life trapping. But man, those rolls. A 1, a 2, and a 3. And I mean, Teardra was probably going to fail. But the other 3, one of them should have succeeded, and none of them did. So I asked him, I'm like, you know, the story does have a little bit of a better ending. Because I didn't call it as a wipe, because they had been wiped actually, they'd been through a couple dungeons since they'd wiped. They wiped back in Curse of Strahd. I said, look, if you want, I can throw a NPC in to try and find you. And they say, well, that's metagaming. And I say, yeah, well, it's either that or sit in the mirror, guys. And they decided to let me make a character. I'm like, I'm going to make an NPC, and maybe he can go ahead and help you out. And so what I had was I spent the time between sessions. I had an NPC made. And basically what I said was, because you don't age in a Mirror of Life trapping, and nothing happens in a Mirror of Life trapping, you're aware that time is passing, but you don't age, you don't need food, you don't need sleep, whatever. So I'm basically like, okay, you spend like 2D100 years in the Mirror of Life trapping before someone comes along. And they ended up spending like 80 years basically just sitting in the Mirror of Life sitting in a Mirror of Life trapping. And one of them's like, well, I play solitaire. And I'm like, technically speaking, the last one in the mirror was Teardrop. She's the only one that can like actually see the corridor. So the rest of you can, I guess play solitaire, whatever. Kind of go slowly insane inside the mirror. While Teardra is in the mirror, but she can actually see the hallway because she was the last one trapped, and she can go slowly insane looking at the same corridor for 80 years. But eventually I did have an NPC come around the corner. I was amused because he turned the corner and he rolled like a natural 20, and everybody just accused me of cheating, and I was like... And one of the players asked me what would have happened if he'd failed, and I said, well, we would be playing new characters about now. And that did not make them feel good. But, he got him out. I don't think we never actually finished that adventure. We never finished that adventure because even though the next room is the last room in the dungeon, and that is it, all they had to do was go into that room and beat it. What happened was we had a delay where we were basically unable to meet for a couple of weeks, and after that, I finally got Tomb of Annihilation up. So I don't know. I thought it was an interesting story. Mirror, mirror on the wall. Who can suck an entire party up with failed saves? Just zoop, like a vacuum cleaner. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it. It may not be one of my most amusing stories, but I thought it was interesting. I will see you again with another story with more gameplay and more reviews and such. Got a bunch of reviews I gotta do. Anyway, this has been the RPG Crawler with an RPG story time. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye.